All right, so what I'd like to do today is to discuss the idea of Uvdin Dechol. All right, Uvdin Dechol is a very frequent concept that comes up in poskim. It's more or less, it's your like go-to concept for anything that you want to forbid on Shabbos. If you want to say something is asur and you don't know why, then you just say, well, it's asur because of Uvdin Dechol. So this is a very useful concept for poskim to fall back onto. Give you some examples. Bikes on Shabbos. Okay, anything wrong with bikes on Shabbos? Good, very good. You're picking up. You're catching on fast. So Reuven to quick learner, and you know, bikes on Shabbos. Yeah, thank you very much. So we have the Ben Ish Chai who says it's mutter, and then we have other poskim who say, yeah, we don't know quite what the problem is, and then you've got this whole batch of poskim that say, well, there's all kinds of problems, and one of the main ones is Uvdin Dechol. Another example we had just a few weeks ago when we spoke about umbrellas. And if you remember, we had a Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish didn't agree. He took issue with the Dayan Yehoshua. Dayan Yehoshua says that umbrellas on Shabbos are asur, and might be d'oraisa, making an oyel, you're making a tent, and so on. And the Chazon Ish is not having any of that, and he says it's not a tent, and it's all completely aray, and it's similar to the case in the Gemara about your folding beds, that you fold it and unfold it, and an umbrella is also made to fold and unfold. So he says there's no oil problem, but says the Chazon Ish, nonetheless, it's very good that we don't use umbrellas on Shabbos because Uvdin Dechol, right? It's Uvdin Dechol. It's not Shabbosdik, right? And now our question is going to be, is there any category, is there any way of defining what are the contours, what are the boundaries of this Uvdin Dechol idea, or is it really just this kind of spare category that anything that you don't quite like and you don't think is very oriented with Shabbos, then you say, well, Uvdin Dechol. So okay, so that's our question. Shalom Rav Davidol, good evening and good to see you. So, first of all, we certainly find in the Gemara, as well as in Rishonim, many, the idea that something should be asur. I have more pages here. The idea that something should be asur because it's the way that it's done in weekdays, rather than, and therefore it should be asur on Shabbos. If you look at the Gemara, at the very top of page 5, right? It's a Mishnah, the Mishnah Masechah Shabbos. This is like a filter, right? And the Gemara says, Midrabanan, the Midrabanan he shelo yasa kederech shehu oiseh b'chol, right? It's a rabbinic prohibition in order that you shouldn't do something in the way that it's done in weekdays. Meaning we find here a source for something which Chazal asad, because we don't want you doing something which is done in the way that it's done during the week. We find also on page 6 at the bottom, we have over here chavish shenishbara. If you have a barrel that breaks, then you can matzil hemena mazon shalosh udos, and you tell other people to save whatever there is. Ubevad shelo yispeg. You mustn't absorb wine in something that absorbs and then that's a way to carry it away by taking something absorbent and having the wine sink into it like a sponge, right? The wine will penetrate the sponge, and that's how you'll save the wine. And the Gemara says, Tana brings a brisa or an interpretation of the Mishnah. Lo yisbeg b'yayin v'lo yitpach b'shemen. You mustn't do either. Oh, I've got a few more. Yep. Lo yisbeg b'yayin v'lo yitpach b'shemen means you use your hand to take the oil off on the back of your hand, and the Gemara says, why not? Shelo ya'aseh kederech shehu oiseh b'chol. You mustn't do it in a way that resembles how we do things on weekdays. Rashi says, "V'asura mishum Uvdin Dechol." Okay, so we've got these two cases in the Gemara. There are other cases, for example, in Meseches Beitza, in Daf, I didn't bring the source here, but in Daf Chav Ches, Amud Aleph, Mishnah Meseches Beitza, that speaks about how you carry things on Shabbos. You mustn't carry a bunch of things and put them in a basket and carry them around. And Rashi says, because also it's Uvdin Dechol, also later on in Meseches Beitza and the beginning of Perek Daled, Mishnah Daf Chav Tes in Beitza, also Rashi explains because of Uvdin Dechol. What's the problem of Uvdin Dechol? What's wrong? What could be the problem? So I think that there are two basic ways of understanding the underlying problem of Uvdin Dechol. One way, and this is pretty explicit in the Ramban, which I don't have here, but we'll see in a minute. We do have the Rambam. The Ramban in Vayikra, in Parashas Emor, where the Torah speaks about Shabbos, and the Torah speaks about Mikroi Kodesh, and we find that that Shabbos is called Shabbosoid, right? Apart from the lav, apart from the Isser of doing Malachos on Shabbos, but there's also a positive mitzvah that one has to rest on Shabbos. It's a Yom Shabbosoid, a day of rest. And the Ramban says, based on this, based on the pasuk there, the Ramban says that somebody who doesn't do any melacha on Shabbos, but at the same time he doesn't rest, meaning he walks around all day schlepping stuff on Shabbos. So even though he hasn't transgressed any prohibition of Shabbos, but nonetheless he's transgressed the positive duty that we have on Shabbos to rest. Shabbos is a day on which we have to spend, it's a day la Hashem, right? Shabbos hayom la Hashem, like we have in the pasuk in Yeshayahu, ki kadosh hayom, right? It's a day which is kadosh to Hashem, and therefore it's a day on which we have to rest. And when the Ramban says that one mustn't be toreach all day, so the Ramban mentions the prohibitions of Uvdin Dechol. The Ramban says, for example, the Ramban says that this is why the pasuk says in Yeshayim Asis Drachecha Mimtzei Cheftecha V'daber Davar, and he says that that's why it has to be distinct. The Ramban doesn't mention the words Uvdin Dechol, but he gives examples of things that Chazal answered because of Uvdin Dechol. For example, he says, opening, moving things around, right? Mibais lebais, lefanes hakelim and avonim. This is what I mentioned before from Meseches Beitza. So the Ramban puts that into this category of refraining from making your Shabbos into a weekday. Shabbos has to be special. Shabbos has to be a day which is dedicated to doing things that are special, especially for Shabbos, and they mustn't become like weekdays. And it seems that, according to the Ramban, this is the general concept of the unique prohibitions of Uvdin Dechol. Even though these prohibitions aren't the full d'oraisa, meaning you're not now making your Shabbos into a weekday, making your Shabbos into a weekday is someone who spends the entire day, schlepping around and really just refraining altogether from having a Shabbos. But even if you don't do that, you don't go to that extent, and you only do these specific things that are very chayildik, they're very reminiscent of the way that people do things on weekdays, that itself is already an Uvdin Dechol. That's well, yeah. So there are a range of halachos on Shabbos, and some of the rabbinic halachos are to refrain from doing other malachos. There's a machlokes why muktzah was why Chazal decreed on muktzah, not our issue now, but certainly it's something that developed, meaning the various things that Chazal said are considered Uvdin Dechol were not forbidden before Chazal said they'd be forbidden. They'd be forbidden if you would do them the whole day and make your Shabbos into a weekday. But as specific actions, that the action itself is forbidden. Okay, for example, the case that we have now of hanging up some kind of a mishameret, some kind of a filter, that's a chayildik thing. Or in the case in Beitza of shifting things around from one place to another in a specific way, carrying things in a basket of some sort, that would be the chayil that Chazal came up with. That Chazal said this is chayil, that it's inappropriate for Shabbos, and therefore they said even if you do it just as a specific instance on Shabbos, as a momentary act, that itself is also because Chazal asked it. Let's see some of the other. It seems that the Ramban, he pulls together his concept of the Doraisa with the things that Chazal asked because of Uvdin Dechol. Meaning, even though those things are Dorabanan, those things don't become Doraisa, but it's the same concept of keeping Shabbos Shabbosdik. That's how the Ramban seems to understand Uvdin Dechol. The Rambam, however, understands it quite differently. If you look in page 5, no, he doesn't use the examples, just from the examples that he gives. Yes, the examples that he gives are examples from Chazal that are related to the concept of shelo yaseh kederech she'oseh b'chol, without using the phrase Uvdin Dechol. Now the Rambam, the tshuva of the Rambam is brought here in the Shvus Yitzchak. It's in Tshuva, it's in Siman Shin Vav, in Shuvas HaRambam, in Chelik Beis. And the Rambam says as follows. Look at the Rambam was asked whether you can hang up a mitznefes, a certain garment. Is that called similar to hanging up a mishameres? Hanging up a mishameres, you're also hanging up a cloth, but the cloth is going to be used as a filter, and the isser is to hang it up. So is there an isser of hanging up anything? And the Rambam says, no, listen, says the Rambam, Rambam, the ena perish be'uvdin dechol lesar kol masha oise b'chol. There's no prohibition of doing anything that we do on weekdays. Dim kain, if so, lo yochal v'lo yasev kederech she'oise b'chol. Right, just like we sit down to eat on weekdays, so you mustn't sit down to eat on Shabbos because it's chayildik, right? It's not Shabbosdik. You would have to eat standing up or eat in some unusual way. It says the Rambam, rather, he says, Dava barahu lemevin she'enat amote le'olam dvarim she'asu chachamim mishum shelo yaseh kederech she'oise b'chol. Chazal never asked anything just because one should refrain from doing things in a chayildik way. That's not the issue. Rather, says the Rambam, only something that could lead you to doing a malacha, says the Rambam. For example, what we just learned before from the Mishnah Masechah Shabbos, right? You mustn't use some sponge or do something with your hand If we'll permit these forms of transporting liquid by allowing them to be absorbed in something solid, then you'll ultimately come to doing schita, right? We find this, the Gemara in the same sugya speaks about hair. This is where the whole issue of schita in hair comes from, because the Gemara mentions transporting oil by allowing the oil to become soaked into your hair. Don't try this at home. And the Gemara says that that would be an issue of schita, to take out the oil from your hair on the other side. Interesting. A big issue on Shabbos, whether there's really a problem of drying one's hair on Shabbos, but not going to get into that now. In any case, says the Rambam concerning Uvdin Dechol, that the entire problem is that it might lead you to doing a malacha. And the same thing with Nispazru Lepeus Bechatseroi, gathering stuff that's been scattered around, which is a problem of Uvdin Dechol, Kederach Shoysa B'chayil, says the Rambam, because there's a problem of Ma'amer and Tlias HaMeshamere, Shema Yavoi L'Shama. Maybe you'll come to use it and you'll filter, and then you'll do Boire or Meshama, which is a similar malacha to Boire. So says the Rambam, the only problem is when it's going to cause you, or it might lead you to do a malacha. If it's nothing related to any type of malacha, then there's no problem of Uvdin Dechol. So these are two very different approaches. And I think we already saw in Rashi that Rashi does not say like the Rambam, right? Rashi says that the whole problem with doing something which is, if we look at the Rashi on page 6, right, Rashi says, right, in the way that Rashi understands the Yitzchak Biyadov, in any case, it doesn't sound like there's anything to do with schita. And then Rashi says, Vasra Mishum Uvdin Dechol. Rashi here is not as explicit as in other places, but Rashi in Beitza, which I don't have here, Rashi in Beitza in two places, Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph, and then in Chav Tes, Rashi in two places says very clearly that the problem is that you're doing something which is the way in which it's done on weekdays. It's a chayildik way. And these are two different approaches to Uvdin Dechol that have tremendous ramifications, right? What can you include in Uvdin Dechol, and what wouldn't be included in Uvdin Dechol? Let's see for a mitzvah, for a moment, excuse me. Let's just see what we have in the Shulchan Aruch. Look at the Shulchan Aruch in Seif Hey. This is at the top of page 7. Right, the top of page 7. Seif Hey. Okay. Nispazru loy peiros bechatzer, echad l'heina ve'echad heina, melaket ma'at ve'oichel. V'lo yiten l'teicha sal, v'lo l'teicha kupa. Right, you mustn't gather things up from one place and another. If they're scattered around in your yard, everything's got scattered up. So you mustn't gather them together. This is based on the Gemara, Shabbos Daf Kuf Mem Aleph, Machlokes and the Rishonim, how to understand it. The Shulchan Aruch paskins like some Rishonim there, the Ramban, that this is how they understand the Issa there, that one mustn't gather scattered things in a yard or in a garden, in a field, because it's Uvdin Dechol. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's an Uvdin Dechol. So the Rambam says that here there is a concern that you would do a malacha of ma'amer. It could lead you to a malacha. But the Mishnah Berurah doesn't go that way. The Mishnah Berurah says, Mechsi Tamid, he says again, the Shulchan Aruch says, if it's become all mixed up with earth and dust, then it's always a problem, even if it's not all scattered around. Again, quite a complicated halacha that I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but the Mishnah Berurah says, what's the problem? In that case, mechazei tamid ke'uvdin dechol. it's very chayildik. It looks like Uvdin Dechol. The next siman in the Shulchan Aruch, look at siman Shin Vav, which I brought over here. Mutter limdei b'Shabbos midida shel mitzvah. Everybody knows one's not allowed to measure on Shabbos. However, says the Shulchan Aruch, one is allowed to do a measurement that's a mitzvah, midida shel mitzvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you know why? He says, well, look at the Mishnah Berurah Sif Koton Lamed Daled, right? Ve'afal gav deloi huta shvus afilu bimkoi mitzvah k'mei shekazavdu le'er b'Sif Koton Chavches shani medida deloi have isu kol kach. It's not so asur ela mishum dehavi k'Uvdin Dechol. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the whole problem with making measurements is only because of Uvdin Dechol. There's no other problem of measurements. Big machlokes and achronim. What's the problem of measuring something on Shabbos? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the only problem of making measurements is because of Uvdin Dechol. And because the whole problem is only Uvdin Dechol, meaning it's something which is chayildik, it's something which is related to weekdays. And because it's something which is chayildik, therefore when it's b'makom mitzvah, then it's mutter, says the Mishnah Berurah. And later on he says, also to measure something for a mitzvah. You know, on Leila Seder, we're all busy making these measurements of how much matzah do we need, how much lettuce do we need, right? Would it be mutter to measure the share shel Torah, to make sure you have the right amount? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes, it's mutter. He says, Kevin shemedet shiurei Torah, lo mechzik Uvdin Dechol. That's not an Uvdin Dechol. Meaning, and over here that you're doing it for, he said, also if you're doing it for a refuah, if you're ill, then you're allowed to make measurements, because that's also a dvar mitzvah.
Same way as here, I'm able to say off the hill, here, I'm not worried about slippery slope. They could say the same thing. You know, school's really far away, I get my bike and off I go.
Right.
Raining today,
So agreed. Good question. When would we say that when it's a dvar mitzvah, right? I find some reason for a mitzvah and then it becomes mutter, and when not? So again, it really depends on the way in which the prohibition was understood. The Chazon Ish, when he says that it's right to answer it, and he says because he says Avshamis, Milsa, and Uvdin Dechol, and then he adds, and also it could lead to, I think I have this Chazon Ish here actually, if we're talking about umbrellas, on page 6. Look at the end. He says, V'nika by Uvdin Dechol, v'goyrem pirza, v'rei asru kila mipnei she'ein pnei Torah, okay, etc. V'harei adava masel chachamim ligda geder, v'makom ha'pirza. V'zeh yoseh chamor meso prati liyachid, k'zeh geder le'am kulai. So he's very busy with exactly what you're saying. Chazon Ish doesn't want people to start saying, well, it's only Uvdin Dechol, and therefore, if it's a dvar mitzvah, so we can be matter it. Says the Chazon Ish, no. It's masel chachamim. This is something which is up to the chachamim of each generation to decide exactly what we can do, exactly what type of isser it is. And he says this is not something which is up to each individual, which is lerabim, because it's something which is, everyone's going to be going around with umbrellas. And clearly his thrust is that it should be asur. Now, and this is similar to what I said at the beginning, that sometimes Uvdin Dechol is a kind of filler. If there's something which we feel should be asur, and yet it's difficult to find an exact parameter within halacha to find what melacha does it fit into, Uvdin Dechol is very useful. While at the same time, this is a real, chachamim are asering, and we have the right to do this in every generation. This is not agreed stuff. If we look at the Shut Marshag on page 7, okay, really yes, because there's no malacha. But he feels that this is something which is going to very much damage the nature of Shabbos. It's going to affect the nature of Shabbos in a negative way. And because it's something which is communal, it's something which is public, so therefore he wants to make it a more severe prohibition, even though, like Ben correctly said, well, Uvdin Dechol, we see in the Mishnah Berurah that you can do things for a mitzvah. It's not a very severe type of prohibition. It's not a full Darabanan. Says the Chazon Ish, this is a public thing. If we look at the Shut Marshag is speaking about riding bikes on Shabbos. Okay, now riding bikes, as we know, doesn't seem to be a Daraisa issue with riding bikes. The one potentially Daraisa issue is Tchumim. If you ride too far out of town, then you'll have an Issa Tchumim, which could be Daraisa. But then again, if you walk too far out of town, you'll have an Issa Tchumim also. Nonetheless, some people say that because bikes are, at the very least nowadays, used for long distance travel, so we should be careful about bikes because of Tchumim. In any case. Well, exactly. So let me show you the following. Says the Marshag, maybe bicycles should be asur because of Uvdin Dechol, because it's not Shabbosdik, right? The Ben Ish Chai, as we know, famously said that bicycles are mutter. He doesn't see a reason to forbid bicycles on Shabbos. Again, this is going back, a good 100 years when bicycles didn't look quite like they look now, and perhaps our more advanced forms of bicycles, he would look at differently. We don't know that. Yes, so that is an issue that's brought up by contemporary poskim. In the time of the Ben Ish Chai, bicycles were really very simple, so there wasn't much to fix. Nowadays, that you've got chains, number one, and beyond chains, you've got gears, and beyond gears, you've got all kinds of other gadgets. So maybe there's more room to speak about that. But the Marshag is concerned. Maybe there's a problem of Uvdin Dechol. Said the Shut Marshag, he brings from Mechabre's Manenu, going back a while, that there's an issue of Uvdin Dechol. Way to go, Avi. Way to go. So that Marshag lived about towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of 20th century. Marshag was Polish Pesach, if I recall correctly, was considered from the Gdolei poskim. Was the Rav of a significant town. I didn't remember where. Maybe it says here. Avi, can you make up where he was the Rav? Yeah, so you can look that up, right? And hey, we even have a date for Ben. This is in Tafresh Ein Hey. Tafresh Ein Hey takes us very close to 100 years ago. So there we go. And says the Marshag, I saw some poskim that wanted to ask bicycles because of Uvdin Dechol. And then he says, it's where we have the little finger pointing at the side, Imishum ha Eina isa barali, ki al pi asvara lo yadati ma Uvdin Dechol shayach bezeh. What kind of Uvdin Dechol is this? Meaning he's a stickler. He's not one of these, poskim that says, well, I'm not quite sure how to answer this, so let's just say it's also because of Uvdin Dechol. He's saying, I don't see why there should be any Uvdin Dechol here. Well, again, number one, you're absolutely right. But why should the Chazon Ish think that umbrellas are not Shabbosdik? In which way are they not Shabbosdik? Why are they not Shabbosdik? It's a hergesh, right? So, well, I would say that these poskim who are saying Uvdin Dechol are saying that's our Hergish, right? People are going to be riding bicycles all over the place. That's not very spirit of Shabbosdik, right? And I think that the Marshag, he probably understands that there is a certain concern for the spirit of Shabbos, and nonetheless he says that's not good enough. Look at what he says. He says, "Ein lanu lechadish gzeros v'yisur midatenu." We can't make this stuff up. Even if you have this Hergish, I think he's saying, even if you do feel that it's not in the spirit of Shabbos, says the Marashag, I'm not Chazon Ish on this. We can't make up new Isurim. If there's no problem in principle of riding bicycles on Shabbos, so Mutalach says the Marashag. He's worried about bicycles for a different reason, by the way. He concludes that bicycles are a problem of Hitzah, right? A problem of tiltal, that you're carrying the bike. The Ben Ish Chai held that there's no problem of tiltal because you're not carrying the bike is carrying you. But the Marashag felt that that's not true. The Marashag felt that the issue of tiltal, again, not our issue right now, but for purposes of Uvdin Dechol, I think the Marashag is very significant. He's saying that you can't just make things up. Yes. So I think that Ruvain is on the ball. I think that it really does depend on that. Meaning, if you say it's a concern for malacha of one type or another, then I would hazard that where Chazal were goizer, like Muktzah that Ben mentioned before, or other Isurim, that's where it's also, we can't make up new Isurim. But if it's a question of making your Shabbos into a weekday, then anything that we feel is weekday-ish will be included in this prohibition. For example, there's a tshuva of the Tzitz Eliezer that speaks about, holding, what's his discussion about? His discussion is about, I think it's listening to radio on Shabbos or something along those lines. And he says, well, there's no formal prohibition, but it's a problem of Uvdin Dechol. And the Tzitz Eliezer says we can make things up in terms of Uvdin Dechol. That's not something that we're limited to. Rav Moshe Feinstein, however, Rav Moshe Feinstein is Rambam Dik. Look at Rav Moshe. It's on page 6. Right, Rav Moshe. Okay, so there's Issa, which is mentioned in the Rivash, and it's paskent in the Shulchan Aruch, that one isn't allowed to use a grater. One mustn't grate cheese on Shabbos. Okay, don't grate your cheese on Shabbos. And this is, I think I've brought it somewhere. Is it? No, that's a Rav Moshe. Yeah, I know, but the Shulchan Aruch brings the Rivash. I'm just looking a minute for the Shulchan Aruch. I thought the Shulchan Aruch is also somewhere here. Not sure. Anyway, whatever. We'll find it. In any case, the bottom of page 5. Oh, thank you very much. Excellent, Avi. Thank you. Shulchan Aruch. Merek charutz is what we call a grater, right? On Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? It's derech chayil. It's derech chayil. It's chayildik. Because this is a kli which is special for grating cheese, and it looks like toichen, right? It looks a bit like toichen. Now, he's not saying that it's also because you might come to grind. Right? If we were the Rambam, we would say it's also because you might come to grind on Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah is not saying that. He's saying it's chayildik, right? Right. He said it's dummy, and therefore it's Well, it's similar to things that you do, similar to a malacha. Yeah, not bad, Avi. Yeah, I hear. One could understand it that way, right? That it's similar dafka to a malacha. I don't think that's what the Mishnah is saying, though. He's saying, it's a weekday way of doing things, and I'm proving that it's a weekday way of doing things because that's how you do these big malachas of grinding spices in your pestle and mortar. So you see, it's like a major malacha. I don't think he's saying that therefore it's similar to an Issa Shabbos. I think and therefore he's saying it, and therefore it's a weekday style. This is weekday style. No, it doesn't have to be with a pestle and mortar. Well, no, the reason why this is a Melecha Shabbos and this isn't because cheese is not a Gedulei Karka. Cheese doesn't grow in the ground, and therefore there's no Issa Teichen on cheese. The Issa Teichen is only on Gedulei Karka, only on things that grow from the earth. And therefore, in theory, there's no problem with grinding cheese, just like you're allowed to cut your meat on Shabbos into teeny tiny pieces. And there's no problem of Teichen on meat because it's not Gedulei Karka. So there shouldn't be a problem of using your grater for cheese. All good. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, it's derech chayil. And Rav Moshe was asked, is there a problem of using special tools that are made for cutting cheese or for cutting eggs? You know, these egg slicers, right? Is there a problem of using an egg slicer on Shabbos? Question mark. What would you say? Well, this grater is special for cheese, and still it's also depends on how you understand Uvdin Dechol, right? If it's like chayildik, then you could say, yeah, well, eggs is also a problem. But if it's a problem of what it might lead to, so I would definitely be able to make a distinction between a grater and an egg slicer. Yeah, you know, this is like grinding something up, and this is like a slicing something. Yeah, not bad. Well, let's see what Rav Moshe says. Okay. Avocado is more of a problem because then that's no, because it's Gedulei Karka. Right. However, I don't think you grate your avocados. Is that on slicing machine for avocados? Could be interesting. Anyway, says Rav Moshe, he says, Uvdin Dechol, not buying it. He said, Mitam Uvdin Dechol lo muvan. I don't think this is any type of Uvdin Dechol. And he gives a very interesting definition for why. He says, well, let me just tell you. Let's skip to the next paragraph. I don't want to read too much here because it's Rav Moshe's wording is not always so easy. But let's look at the next paragraph. He explains what he says. He says, "It's when the malacha becomes good. Kamalacha kavua the oisin b'chayil, like a proper malacha that you do on weekdays. V'loy nika inyan asiyas arai shenazis b'loy kpeda kol kach ala malacha shtazis yofe." Says Rav Moshe, Uvdin Dechol is only when you're trying to do your malacha really well. When you're trying to do your malacha in a kind of professional way, in the way in which it's done on weekdays, meaning by professionals. There are these professional people who are doing the malacha really, really well, and if you're doing the malacha really, really well in this type of way, which is done by professionals on chayil, that's the idea of Uvdin Dechol. However, if you're doing your malacha not in a professional way, but you're just trying to make your life easier, right? Using an egg slicer is just making life easier rather than using a knife you're slicer. It's not that you're doing something in a very professional way, in a way that is reminiscent of a meleches chayil. Again, Rav Moshe doesn't quite give us the boundaries of when this would apply and when it wouldn't apply. But nonetheless, he is going in I would say he's not saying, well, it's chayildik. He's giving us much more of a condition of when it would apply. If you're just doing something to make your life easier, says Rav Moshe, that wouldn't fall into Uvdin Dechol. It's reminiscent of something which is professional, something which you're doing a malacha in a very high quality way, then it's considered Uvdin Dechol. Yes, Avi. No, the egg slicer isn't professional, and therefore it's okay. Yeah, something which has, again, he's got the rivash to deal with. He doesn't want to extend the rivash too far, and therefore it says the rivash is something which, when you use a proper grater, then you're doing something which is, it's like it's an expert's tool. I don't know. We would say that a grater isn't so much of an expert tool, but he's saying that the grater isn't to. I guess it's just the way that you perceive it. He's saying that we perceive cheese being grated. Let's see the lashon of Rav Moshe. He says we see cheese that's being grated as. So I said tchina dacha k'moshe oisen b'chayil. He says, and then he says v'chein livra b'kina v'tamchui malacha kazusha oisen b'chayil. It doesn't look like you're doing something which is araidik, meaning not in a professional kavua way, the way that you're going to work. This is how we do things when we own a restaurant. Ela kavua. Yeah. Rav Moshe does not want to extend the issa that we find in the rivash to your everyday stuff. And he says, why doesn't it extend to your everyday stuff? He says, because there's something special here, because we're trying to do something in a professional manner. Now, I agree with you that the distinction isn't crystal clear. But by the way, this is also how Rav Shlomo Zalman paskins. Very interesting. So, good question. And the answer is, no, he didn't. And I think that's very telling. When Rav Moshe wanted to answer time switches, he did not use Uvdin Dechol. He said that it's a zilusa de Shabbos. The wording in Rav Moshe there is, it's zilusa de Shabbos. Now, I think if Rav Moshe would have been the Chazon Ish, that's exactly what the Chazon Ish is saying. It's like a zilusa de Shabbos. So it's like Uvdin Dechol. But Rav Moshe, about time switches, when he says you mustn't use them, he does not say Uvdin Dechol. So I think that's a very good point, and it's very telling about Rav Moshe's shita. Rav Moshe is saying you can't extend Uvdin Dechol to, wherever you want. It doesn't work that way. It has boundaries. It has to be used sparsely, specifically in certain areas. While the Chazon Ish is or the Tzitziliyas are also. It's saying we can extend Uvdin Dechol to wherever we think it's not so Shabbosdik. Rav Ovadia Yosef, actually, he also goes similar to the Rambam. The Tshuva is speaking about using a baby carriage where there's an eruv, and he has a tshuva to somebody who wanted to say it should be also because of Uvdin Dechol, and he says no way. He says you can't say that anything becomes Uvdin Dechol. That wouldn't work. However, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef mentions a couple of other considerations that poskim mention in the context of Uvdin Dechol, and one of those considerations is tircha. If something is a big tircha, something is a heavy workload, then there's more room to include it in the category of Uvdin Dechol, because there's a tircha there, therefore it's very choildik, and therefore there's more room to include it. And again, that goes back to the Ramban that we mentioned at the beginning, right? The Ramban says you're making your Shabbos into a weekday. So if you're having a very, if you're exerting, there's a lot of exertion involved in doing it, then there's more room to include it in the category of Uvdin Dechol. That's what Rav Moshe Feinstein says over there. And there are other poskim who mention this. Let's just show you I think it's on page 6 in Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa. Shmir Shabbos says, "Ein lishtamesh b'kli hamiyuchad lechituch batzal." One mustn't use a special set of knives, which is very fancy, and it's used for cutting up onions in a very thorough way. Says, and the reason why is because this is similar to toichen, right? This is something which is like toichen. You're dicing up the onions very thin, and that's similar to toichen. This is our egg slicer, right? It's a line of blades that are distanced from one another in the appropriate way for slicing up your eggs. And he says that's fine to use on Shabbos. And downstairs in the notes, he says, well, maybe this will be Uvdin Dechol, right? So he says no. He says if it's something which is used for toichen, right? Something which is used for store owners, meaning it's something very professional. It's something that you go to work with. That's Uvdin Dechol. Lachein also mishum Uvdin Dechol. Ma she'en ke mekatetz beitzim shu mechuba mekama sakinim regilos oy mechute mateches. He says, come on, that's a regular kli seuda. It's not a professional kli. That's an everyday home appliance that everyone uses, and therefore there's no Uvdin Dechol over here. And he says, by the way, you can even use it to slice up your tomato, right? Even though a tomato has a problem of toichen, but he said this is not toichen, they're big pieces, and therefore he's not worried about them, even for your tomatoes, because this would not go under the category of Uvdin Dechol on the one hand, and it wouldn't be called toichen on the other. And he quotes from this tshuva of Rav Moshe, brought just beneath his Piskei Tshuva, that says, yeah, some people don't like this, and it's also has an element of Uvdin Dechol and so on. Again, which really falls into our question of how do you categorize Uvdin Dechol? What can you put into Uvdin Dechol? And I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but I was once asked if it's mutter to play table tennis on Shabbos. And being myself a table tennis enthusiast, I said, yeah, it's mutter. Again, depends for who and so on. It's like we spoke about last week, something that we have oinik from on Shabbos, that then it would be mutter, not necessarily recommended. Spend your Shabbos learning Torah and so on. But at the very least, if you need a bit of recreation or for children, then there's no issue. And he said, well, I asked a different rabbi, you always love these guys that go shopping for the rabbis. So he said, I asked a different rabbi, and he said it's asur. And I said, why would it be asur? And he said, well, the other rabbi said it's Uvdin Dechol. So there you go. And I told him, if you're really worried about Uvdin Dechol, then you can set aside, you can dedicate special bats that they should be your Shabbos bats, and then you wouldn't have the problem of Uvdin Dechol, because this is your Shabbos sticker table tennis. Anyway, toothbrushes. Yeah, so Rabbi Yosef, when he speaks about brushing teeth on Shabbos, he's not worried about the dedication of toothbrushes for Shabbos. He goes through the Yisurim, he doesn't see any Yisur in it. But yes, some people think it's choildik, and therefore dedicate a Shabbos toothbrush. Again, so dedicate knives and forks for Shabbos, Yes, we'll stop there.